You know, I've always believed in a simple philosophy: live and let live. My ranch, Solitude Springs, it's been in my family for 3 generations. It's not just land, it's sweat, blood, memories, and a whole lot of cow manure, which, frankly, is the smell of honest work to me. We are talking rolling hills, a creek that whispers secrets if you listen close enough, and enough space that your nearest neighbor is usually a curious deer or a coyote calling out to the moon. For decades, the only real encroachment we dealt with was the occasional stray tourist looking for a shortcut, or the slow creep of the county road needing a bit more shoulder. Then, they built Whispering Pines Estates. Now, I'm not against progress, not really. People need places to live. But Whispering Pines wasn't just a housing development, it was an event. Manicured lawns that looked like they were cut with nail scissors, houses packed in so tight you could probably pass a cup of sugar through your bathroom window to the next-door neighbor's kitchen, and an HOA, oh boy, the Homeowners Association. It was like they were trying to airlift a slice of sterile suburbia and plop it down right next to a working ranch, then act surprised when the two didn't exactly blend like coffee and cream. The first few years were tolerable. A few grumbles about the early morning moo of a hungry calf, a wrinkled nose at the scent of the earth being turned for planting. I'd just smile, wave, and remind myself that country air isn't for everyone. But then Brenda arrived. Or rather, Brenda ascended. She got herself elected HOA president of Whispering Pines, and suddenly, the wind shifted. Brenda was one of those people who probably alphabetized her spice rack and considered a dandelion on the lawn a personal affront. She had a helmet of perfectly lacquered hair, a voice that could curdle milk at 50 paces, and an unwavering conviction that her interpretation of community standards was the only one that mattered. My ranch, clearly, did not meet Brenda's standards. It wasn't tidy, the fence line, sturdy and functional for keeping several tons of prime beef where it belonged, was apparently an eyesore, because it was weathered wood, not pristine white vinyl. My rooster, General TSO, whose morning crow was my alarm clock, was a noise pollutant, the very essence of Solitude Springs. The earthy, agricultural aroma that clung to the air after a good rain was an olfactory offense. The complaint started small, delivered with a tight smile and a condescending tone during her accidental strolls near my property line. "Just a friendly heads up, John," she'd chirp. "Some of the residents are a little sensitive." I'd usually just nod, grunt something noncommittal, and go back to mending a fence or checking on my herd. I figured she was a harmless busybody, all bark and no bite. Oh, how wrong I was. The veiled comments started soon after. "We are just trying to maintain a certain aesthetic for Whispering Pines, you understand, or it's important for property values that the surrounding areas are presentable. My family's legacy, presentable. I could feel a slow burn starting in my gut, but I'm a patient man. Or at least, I try to be." I told myself she was just new to the power, flexing muscles she didn't quite know how to control. But there was a glint in her eye, a sort of predatory focus when she looked at my land, that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. She started talking about monitoring the situation and ensuring adherence to community well-being, which was rich, considering my ranch was the community long before her prefabricated paradise ever broke ground. I wasn't part of her HOA, a fact I'd politely pointed out on more than one occasion. It didn't seem to register. To Brenda, her domain apparently extended to anything that offended her sensibilities within a 5-mile radius. I just wanted to be left alone, to work my land, to live my life. But I was getting the distinct impression that Brenda had other plans. And Brenda, I was starting to realize, was the kind of person who didn't give up easily. This wasn't just about a messy fence line anymore, this was about something more fundamental. This was about her trying to impose her will on my world, and that was a line I wasn't about to let her cross without a fight. The peace of Solitude Springs was under siege, and the invading general had a helmet of immovable hair. The discovery was almost anticlimactic in its mundanity, yet it sent a jolt of pure, undiluted rage through me that I hadn't felt in years. I was riding the fence line on the western edge of my property, the part that abutted the pristine common area of Whispering Pines. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air is so clear it almost hurts your lungs, and the distant mountains look like you could reach out and touch them. I was checking for any breaks, any signs of wear, when something caught my eye. Tucked into the dense foliage of an overgrown pyracantha bush on their side, but angled with an almost predatory precision directly onto my land, was a camera. Not a little wildlife cam, mind you. This was a sleek, modern security camera, the kind with night vision and probably Wi-Fi connectivity. It was small, discreetly placed, clearly intended not to be easily seen from my side unless you were practically on top of it. My blood ran cold, then hot. Disbelief warred with a sudden, sickening certainty. Brenda. It had to be. This was her monitoring the situation taken to a whole new, invasive level. My first instinct was to rip it down, smash it to pieces. But I held back. I needed to be smart about this. I dismounted, tethered my horse, and took a closer look. The lens was aimed squarely at my main corral, my barn, the access road to my house. It would capture every vehicle, every person, every animal moving through that part of my ranch. My private life, my work, laid bare for Brenda's perusal. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I felt like a bug under a microscope. I spent the next hour meticulously documenting its position with my phone, taking photos from multiple angles, noting its exact line of sight. I even used an old surveyor's trick to estimate its field of view. It wasn't pointed at their common area for security, as I was sure she'd claim. It was pointed at me. That evening, I hit the internet. Local ordinances, state laws on surveillance. It was a bit of a grey area if it was on her property pointing outwards, but if it was capturing areas where I had a reasonable expectation of privacy like inside my barn, or my house windows if the angle was right, then it was a different story. And regardless of legality, it was a profound violation. This wasn't about a rogue tumbleweed anymore, this was spying. Pure and simple. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I had a feeling they'd see it as a petty neighbor dispute, tell us to work it out. I thought about calling a lawyer, and I knew that would come eventually, but that was a slow, expensive grind. My mind was already churning. Brenda had escalated. She had crossed a fundamental line. My internal monologue was a mix of cold fury and a strange, almost attached curiosity about how far she was willing to take this. Did she really think I wouldn't notice? Or did she just not care? The feeling of being watched, of my sanctuary being violated by her prying electronic eye, settled deep in my bones. It was more than annoying, it was offensive. It was a challenge. And if there's one thing 3 generations of ranchers learn, it's how to meet a challenge head-on. The peace of Solitude Springs hadn't just been disturbed, it had been actively invaded. Brenda had planted her flag, or rather her camera, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like stone in my gut, that this was just the beginning. The battle lines were drawn, and she had just handed me my casus belli. My first official move was a carefully worded cease and desist letter. I typed it up myself, keeping it polite but firm. I cited invasion of privacy, trespass by surveillance, and requested the immediate removal of the offending device. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, so there'd be no question she received it. I even included a couple of the clearer photos I'd taken of the camera, and its direct line of sight onto my property. I figured a clear, unequivocal statement of my position was the right first step. Perhaps, I thought optimistically, she'd realize she'd overstepped and quietly remove it. That optimism lasted about as long as a snowball in July. A week later, I received a response, not from Brenda directly, but from some high-powered law firm in the city, the kind with names like Sterling, Thorne and Abernathy on their letterhead. The tone was dismissive, almost contemptuous. It stated that the camera was situated on HOA common property, was for the purpose of monitoring the perimeter for the safety and security of Whispering Pines residents, and that its orientation was purely incidental. Incidental. It was aimed like a sniper rifle at my barn. The letter went on to imply that perhaps I was the one creating a disturbance, and that my unneighborly conduct was the real issue. They even had the gall to suggest that my letter constituted harassment of Ms. Brenda Millhouse, so that was her full name, good to know, and the HOA board. I read it twice, a muscle twitching in my jaw. So, that was how she wanted to play it. Double down, lawyer up, and try to paint me as the villain. The sheer arrogance was astounding. Then, the official complaints started arriving, almost as if orchestrated by the camera itself. Suddenly, I was getting formal-looking HOA violation notices again, despite not being a member. Dear property owner adjacent to Whispering Pines Estates, they'd begin. One cited improper storage of agricultural equipment visible from HOA property. My perfectly functional, albeit old, John Deere tractor parked near my barn. Another complained about excessive dust generation during routine agricultural activities, which meant I was plowing my own field. My personal favorite was the one about failure to maintain aesthetic harmony with community standards due to the presence of a rusted barrel. It was an old burn barrel I used occasionally, tucked away behind a shed, barely visible. These weren't just Brenda's drive-by critiques anymore. These were pseudo-legal documents, designed to intimidate, to build some sort of paper trail against me. It was clear she was using the camera to document these infractions. Each letter was a little stab, a reminder that she was watching, judging, and escalating. I started my own meticulous file. Every letter she sent, every photograph I took of the camera, notes on dates and times, copies of my own correspondence. If she was building a case, then so was I. I also started talking to a few folks. There was a retired couple in Whispering Pines, the Hendersons, who seemed more down-to-earth than most. I'd helped Mr. Henderson pull his car out of a ditch one winter, and we'd struck up a nodding acquaintance. I caught him out gardening one afternoon and casually mentioned the new security measures the HOA had implemented. He rolled his eyes. Brenda, he sighed. She's on a power trip. Most of us just want to live peacefully, but she's got this bee in her bonnet about your ranch. Thinks it's dragging down our property values. He lowered his voice. Between you and me, a lot of us are embarrassed. But she controls the board, and frankly, she's a bully. That confirmed what I suspected. Brenda wasn't just an annoyance, she was a petty tyrant in her own little kingdom. And her kingdom, in her mind, was apparently expanding. The camera stayed put. If anything, I thought I saw a new glint on it, like it had been cleaned or adjusted. The feeling of being constantly scrutinized was wearing thin. My home, my sanctuary, felt tainted. Every time I walked out to the barn, I felt that unseen eye on me. It was a constant, low-level hum of irritation and anger. This wasn't just about a camera anymore. This was about principle. This was about her relentless, unwarranted intrusion into my life and my property. And I was starting to realize that polite letters and quiet documentation weren't going to be enough. Brenda was a bulldozer, and you don't stop a bulldozer by asking it nicely to change direction. The frustration was building into a proper storm cloud inside me. The legal route, while an option I kept in my back pocket, felt like wading through molasses. It would be slow, costly, and the outcome uncertain. The sheriff's office, as I'd suspected, had been sympathetic when I'd informally inquired, but they'd basically said it was a civil matter unless she was trespassing to place the camera, which I couldn't definitively prove without my own surveillance catching her in the act right at that moment. And even then, it'd be a slap on the wrist. I needed something different. Something that would hit Brenda where she lived, both metaphorically and, as it turned out, quite literally. I was sitting at my kitchen table one evening, nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring at the growing pile of her ridiculous HOA complaint letters. Each one was a testament to her pettiness, her obsession. The aesthetic disharmony of weathered fence posts, unregulated crowing by resident rooster, general TSO, the existential threat of tumbleweeds, it was almost comical, if it wasn't so infuriatingly invasive. And then it hit me. It wasn't a lightning bolt, more like a slow, dawning realization, a wicked little seed of an idea that started to sprout with alarming speed. She was so proud of her complaints, so convinced of her righteousness, so determined to document my supposed failings. What if I helped her? What if I put her words, her meticulous observations, her official pronouncements, on display for everyone to see? Not just for me to see in these little letters, but for her to see. Every single day. The image formed in my mind with startling clarity, a billboard. A big one. On my property, of course, perfectly legal. And on that billboard, a curated collection of Brenda Millhouse's greatest hits, her complaints, quoted verbatim, or as close as legally advisable, right there, facing her precious Whispering Pines estates, and more specifically, her own house, which I knew from Mr. Henderson backed onto the common area near that pyracantha bush. The thought was so audacious, so deliciously petty, that a genuine laugh escaped me, the first in weeks. It was perfect. It wasn't slander if it was her own words. It wasn't harassment if it was on my land. It was just information. Publicly shared. The next morning, I was on the county zoning website. Agricultural land often has different rules, sometimes fewer restrictions on structures like signs, especially if they are not commercial advertising. And Solitude Springs was definitely agricultural. I scrolled through ordinances, bylaws, land use regulations. And there it was, a little loophole, or perhaps just an overlooked clause, non-illuminated signs under a certain square footage, pertaining to activities or statements related to the property itself, were generally permissible without a special permit, provided they met setback requirements. My planned location, well within my property line, but perfectly visible to Brenda's house and the main entrance to Whispering Pines, fit all the criteria. The seed of the idea was now a rapidly growing sapling. I started sketching, thinking about size, materials. It needed to be sturdy, weather-resistant. This wasn't going to be a flimsy protest sign, this was going to be a monument to her meddling. My internal monologue was having a field day. Part of me, the stoic, practical rancher, was thinking, this is insane. This is escalating things to a ridiculous degree, but another part, the part that had been poked and prodded and spied on for months, was rubbing its hands together with glee. She started it, this part reasoned. She wanted her complaints known. Well, her wish is my command. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, though I couldn't deny a certain satisfying thrum of that emotion. It was about communication. Brenda clearly wasn't listening to polite letters. Maybe she'd listen to a 20-foot-wide echo of her own voice. The smile on my face was probably a little unhinged, but I didn't care. I finally had a plan. A big plan. The next few weeks were a flurry of clandestine activity, a delightful counterpoint to Brenda's ongoing, oblivious campaign of petty grievances. It was like she was actively helping me gather material for my masterpiece. A new letter arrived, this one complaining about the unpleasant odor emanating from a compost pile, my compost pile, which was turning kitchen scraps and yard waste into black gold for my vegetable garden, was apparently now a public nuisance. Perfect. I added it to the growing collection of Brenda's gems. I meticulously went through every communication from her and the HOA. I highlighted the most absurd, the most officious sounding, the ones that best showcased her unique brand of Karen-esque entitlement. I wanted a good mix of the truly ridiculous, excessive mooing during twilight hours, and the more subtly infuriating failure to adhere to prevailing community visual standards. It was an art form, curating this list. For the design, I envisioned something stark and official-looking. Big, bold, black letters on a white background. No fancy graphics, no distractions. Just her words, writ large. The title practically wrote itself. Official concerns of Whispering Pines HOA President Brenda Milhouse regarding Solitude Springs Ranch beneath it. A bulleted list of her choicest complaints. I even considered adding a small, discreet line at the bottom, source. Official HOA correspondence and surveillance, too on the nose. Maybe. I'd decide later. I started making calls. First, to a couple of local sign companies. The quotes were significant. This wasn't going to be cheap. But then I thought about the cost to my peace of mind, the constant irritation of her surveillance. Suddenly, it seemed like a worthwhile investment. I also considered building the frame myself. I'm pretty handy with wood and tools comes with the territory of running a ranch. A sturdy wooden frame, some heavy-duty exterior plywood, and professional vinyl lettering. That might be more cost-effective and give me more control. I started sketching out structural designs. Then, I did something I rarely do, I called my lawyer. Not the high-powered city slickers Brenda used, but old Tom Callahan, who'd handled my grandfather's will and knew every zoning loophole in 3 counties. I laid out my plan, expecting him to tell me I was crazy. Instead, he chuckled. A long, slow, appreciative chuckle. "John," he said, his voice crinkling with amusement, "that is the most gloriously passive-aggressive, legally sound piece of retaliation I've heard of in years. As long as you're quoting her own documented statements or factual summaries, and it's on your land, and you're not violating any specific sign ordinances regarding obscenity or direct commercial advertising, she'll hate it, but she'll have a hell of a time making you take it down." He gave me a few pointers on phrasing, how to ensure it was clearly presented as her concerns, not mine, to avoid any misinterpretation of it being my statement about her, which could stray into trickier territory. "Make it clear you're just publicizing her official position," he advised, a smile in his voice. Fortified by Tom's cautious green light, I started gathering materials. Lumber, heavy-duty posts, outdoor paint. I even found a local print shop that could do large-scale vinyl lettering for a reasonable price. I kept my project under wraps. Only my oldest ranch hand, Earl, who'd seen it all and then some, was privy to the full extent of the plan. His reaction was a slow grin and a single word, beautiful. Meanwhile, Brenda, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just over her fence line, continued her little reign of terror. I swear, I saw her out with binoculars one afternoon, peering towards my property. The camera was still there, its little red light occasionally blinking in the dusk. She even sent a new complaint via email, forwarded through her lawyers, about unsecured livestock, because one of my cows had apparently moved too close to the fence line for her liking. "Perfect," I muttered, printing it out. Fresh material, the anticipation was almost as good as the imagined execution. This wasn't just a billboard, it was a carefully constructed response, a mirror held up to her own absurdity. And soon, very soon, she was going to get a front row seat. The day of the installation dawned bright and clear, almost mockingly cheerful given the act of suburban warfare I was about to unleash. I'd recruited Earl and two of his strapping nephews, good hard-working lads who owed me a favor or two, and, more importantly, had a healthy disrespect for officious busybodies. We'd pre-dug the post holes the week before, a good 3 feet deep, well within my property line, but angled for maximum visibility from Brenda's 2-story executive home and the main drag into Whispering Pines. The sign itself was assembled in my barn, 2 massive sheets of treated plywood, painted a stark, institutional white. The vinyl lettering, which I'd painstakingly applied the night before, gleamed under the barn lights. It was magnificent in its sheer, unadulterated pettiness. We loaded the sections onto my flatbed trailer, along with bags of concrete mix, levels, and an arsenal of tools. Earl, a man of few words but profound understanding, just winked at me as he hefted a sack of concrete. "She ain't gonna know what hit her." Boss getting the posts set and leveled took the better part of the morning. We worked methodically, a strange mix of grim determination and suppressed giggles. Every so often, I'd glance over towards Whispering Pines. No sign of Brenda yet. Probably still perfecting her helmet of hair, or drafting another complaint about the audacity of my existing. Finally, it was time to hoist the panels. They were heavy, awkward. But with 4 of us, we managed to wrestle them into place, bolting them securely to the heavy-duty posts. As the second panel locked in, completing the message, I stepped back to admire our handiwork. It was glorious. Dominating the view, clear as day, was the proclamation, "Official concerns of Whispering Pines HOA President Brenda Milhouse regarding Solitude Springs Ranch," and beneath it, in crisp, impossible-to-ignore lettering, the aesthetic disharmony of weathered fence posts. Unregulated crowing by resident rooster, General TSO. The existential threat of tumbleweeds. Improper storage of agricultural equipment, vintage tractor division. Excessive dust generation during essential plowing activities. Unpleasant odors emanating from organic composting initiatives. Failure to maintain visual standards via rusted burn barrel. Unsecured livestock engaging in provocative mooing near fence line. And just for a final flourish, in slightly smaller print at the very bottom, all concerns meticulously documented via unsolicited surveillance and official HOA correspondence. Solitude Springs Ranch, just trying to farm here since 1953. I couldn't help it. A wide grin spread across my face. Earl was chuckling openly, slapping his knee. His nephews were trying to stifle laughs, exchanging incredulous looks. "Well, John," Earl said, wiping a tear from his eye, "if that don't get her attention, nothing will." We packed up our tools, leaving the billboard standing proud and tall, a monument to one woman's meddling. I drove the truck back towards my house, taking the long way around so I could get a good view from the road leading into Whispering Pines. It was even better from a distance. Unmissable. Provocative. Hilarious. I settled onto my porch with a pair of binoculars and a fresh cup of coffee, positioning myself for the show. It didn't take long. Around 10:30, Brenda's pristine white SUV pulled out of her driveway. It stopped dead in the middle of the road. Even from this distance, I could imagine the expression on her face. The car sat there for a good minute, then slowly, almost hesitantly, pulled back into her driveway. A few minutes later, she emerged on foot, marching towards the fence line, phone pressed to her ear. Her posture was rigid, radiating indignation. She stopped, stared, gesticulated wildly into the phone. I could almost hear the sputtering outrage. Then, other residents started to notice. A dog walker paused, did a double-take, then hurried away, probably to spread the news. Cars slowed down as they entered or left Whispering Pines, drivers craning their necks. The phones probably started ringing all over that little subdivision. Brenda paced back and forth, phone still glued to her ear. She looked like a caged tiger, if tigers wore pastel pantsuits. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted like victory. This was just the opening salvo, of course. The real fireworks were yet to come. But for now, watching Brenda Milhouse get a taste of her own medicine, writ large against the morning sky, was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The quiet of Solitude Springs was momentarily broken by the distant, faint sound of what might have been a shriek of fury. Music to my ears. The fallout was, in a word, spectacular. Within an hour of the Billboard's grand unveiling, the first official vehicle arrived, a county sheriff's patrol car. Deputy Miller, a young guy I knew vaguely from the feed store, climbed out looking a mixture of stern and deeply amused. Brenda was right behind him, practically vibrating with indignation, pointing an accusatory finger at my magnificent creation. "John," Deputy Miller said, trying to keep a straight face as he approached my porch, "Ms. Milhouse here has lodged a complaint." Several complaints, actually. Harassment, public nuisance, zoning violation. She even threw in visual terrorism, for good measure. I invited him up for a coffee, which he politely declined, though his eyes twinkled. I calmly explained my position. "Deputy," I said, "that billboard is on my private property. Every statement on it is either a direct quote or a factual summary of official correspondence I've received from Ms. Milhouse or the Whispering Pines HOA. I have the documentation to prove it." I gestured towards the thick file on my porch table. "As for zoning, I checked. It meets all the county requirements for a non-commercial sign on agricultural land. And last I checked, quoting someone accurately isn't harassment, especially when they've been harassing me with unsolicited complaints and surveillance for months." I then showed him the photos of Brenda's camera, its clear aim at my property, and a few choice examples of her complaint letters. Deputy Miller's expression shifted from forced neutrality to something approaching understanding, maybe even a hint of sympathy. He walked over to the fence line, squinted at the billboard, then looked back at Brenda, who was practically hopping mad. He had a quiet word with her, most of which I couldn't hear, but I caught phrases like private property rights, freedom of speech, and "I can't see a law being broken here." Brenda did not take this well. Her voice rose several octaves. I believe the phrase dereliction of duty was used. Deputy Miller, to his credit, remained professional. He eventually got back in his car and drove off, leaving Brenda fuming by the roadside, staring daggers at my billboard and then at me. Round one to the rancher. But Brenda wasn't one to give up. Next came the calls to county code enforcement. A rather harried-looking gentleman named Mr. Henderson, no relation to my sympathetic neighbors, unfortunately, showed up a day later with a clipboard and a measuring tape. He, too, was subjected to Brenda's tirade. I, again, calmly presented my case, my zoning research, and the dimensions of the sign. Mr. Henderson, after much measuring and consulting of his regulations, reluctantly agreed that, as far as he could tell, the sign was compliant. "It's unusual, Mr. Anderson," he conceded, "but it doesn't appear to be violating any current ordinances." Brenda looked like she might spontaneously combust. Her next move was to try and rally the HOA board. I heard snippets from my Henderson allies inside Whispering Pines. Apparently, the emergency board meeting was fiery. Brenda demanded they take legal action, sue me, get an injunction, anything to remove the offensive eyesore. However, some board members, now faced with the stark reality of Brenda's petty complaints being broadcast to the entire neighborhood and anyone driving by, were starting to get cold feet. The billboard wasn't just embarrassing Brenda, it was making the entire HOA look ridiculous. Why were we even sending him these letters about his rooster? One was rumored to have asked. He's not even in the HOA. The first cracks in Brenda's empire were appearing. Then, the local news got wind of it. A small town like ours, a billboard war between a crusty old rancher and an uptight HOA president. That was ratings gold. A young reporter and a cameraman showed up. I gave them a calm, factual interview, explaining I was merely exercising my free speech rights on my own property to highlight an ongoing issue of privacy invasion and harassment. I showed them the camera. Brenda had, by this point, not yet removed it, probably out of sheer stubbornness, or because she hadn't figured out how to do it without me noticing. I let them read a few of Brenda's complaint letters. The reporter's eyes widened. Brenda, when approached, apparently gave a tearful, indignant interview about being bullied and her concerns for community safety and standards being mocked. The resulting news segment, which aired that evening, was illuminating. I came across as a reasonable, albeit creatively retaliatory, landowner. Brenda came across as unhinged. The comment section on the news station's website was overwhelmingly in my favor. People love an underdog, especially one sticking it to an overzealous HOA. Life on Solitude Springs continued, but with a new soundtrack, the distant hum of Brenda's fury, the occasional honk from a supportive passerby, and the satisfying thud of another of her ridiculous plans hitting a brick wall. The billboard stood, a silent sentinel, broadcasting her pettiness to the world. And every morning, when the sun hit it just right, I imagined Brenda Milhouse looking out her bedroom window and being greeted by her own words. It was, I had to admit, a beautiful thing. The billboard became something of a local landmark almost overnight. People I didn't even know would drive slowly past the entrance to Whispering Pines, some even pulling over to take pictures. Teenagers found it hilarious. Other folks who'd had their own run-ins with overzealous HOAs elsewhere offered silent, fist-pumping salutes as they drove by. Solitude Springs Ranch was suddenly famous, or perhaps infamous, depending on your perspective. For the residents of Whispering Pines, however, it was a source of acute and growing embarrassment. The Hendersons told me the atmosphere in the community was tense. HOA meetings, which Brenda usually ran with an iron fist, devolved into shouting matches. Residents, who had previously been cowed by Brenda's aggressive certainty, were now openly questioning her judgment and leadership. "Brenda, this has gone too far," one resident reportedly exclaimed. "We look like fools." My cousin from 3 states over called me asking about the crazy complaint billboard. The HOA's legal fees were also becoming a hot topic. Brenda, in her desperate attempts to find some legal angle to force me to remove the sign, had their lawyers working overtime. She tried cease and desist letters, which Tom Callahan and I had a good laugh over before filing them away. She'd explored nuisance laws, even looked into whether the content could be considered defamatory. Hard to argue when it was her own documented words. Each attempt was a dead end, costing the HOA money and achieving nothing but further cementing my resolve. The pressure was clearly getting to Brenda. One afternoon, I was out mending a fence not far from the infamous pyracantha bush when I saw movement. It was Brenda, looking furtive, accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, possibly a handyman, or a very reluctant HOA board member. They were at the bush, and after a bit of awkward fumbling, the camera Brenda's all-seeing eye was removed. She didn't even try to be subtle about it, just snatched it and scurried away, casting a venomous glare towards my property. I, of course, had my own discreetly placed trail cam monitoring that exact spot ever since her camera appeared. I had lovely footage of the camera's ignominious removal. A small victory, but a significant one. The instrument of her surveillance was gone. The billboard, however, remained. Its purpose had partially been served, but the public humiliation aspect was still in full effect. Inside Whispering Pines, the whispers against Brenda grew louder. Talk of a vote of no confidence began to circulate. Her power base, built on bluster and intimidation, was crumbling now that her tactics were so publicly exposed and backfiring so spectacularly. Some residents, emboldened by my stand or perhaps just fed up with the constant drama, started to push back on her other petty enforcements within their own community. It was like the billboard had lanced a boil. I even received a few anonymous notes slipped into my mailbox. One, on crisp, expensive-looking stationery, simply said, "Thank you for standing up to her. Some of us have wanted to for years." A grateful neighbor, another, scrawled on a napkin, read, "That billboard is awesome. Go get M." It was heartening to know I wasn't entirely alone in my assessment of Brenda's reign. The billboard had done more than just annoy Brenda, it had exposed her methods, and in doing so, had started to dismantle her authority from within her own ranks. The HOA was eating itself, and all I had to do was keep my grass cut to a reasonable, ranch-appropriate height, of course, and let my rooster crow. The tide, it seemed, was turning. Brenda had sowed the wind with her invasive camera and ridiculous complaints, and now she, and the HOA she tyrannized, were reaping the whirlwind, broadcast daily in 20-foot-wide glory. The calls for a truce started subtly. First, it was Mr. Henderson, my informant, casually mentioning that some folks on the board are looking for a way to de-escalate things. He hinted that Brenda was becoming increasingly isolated, her usual allies distancing themselves from the billboard fiasco. Then, a week later, I received a very formal, very cautiously worded letter. Not from Brenda's high-priced city lawyers this time, but from a local attorney I knew to be more reasonable, someone the HOA had apparently retained in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. The letter requested a meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern and to explore avenues for a resolution, no demands, no threats. Just a very polite invitation to talk. I showed it to Tom Callahan. "They are blinking, John," he said with a satisfied grin. "Brenda's probably been sidelined, or at least muzzled. They want that billboard down, and they know they can't force you. So now, they have to ask nicely." I agreed to the meeting, but on my terms. It would be at Tom's office, neutral ground, and I wanted to know who would be representing the HOA. The response came back. It would be 2 board members, Mr. Peterson, a quiet accountant I'd seen around, and Mrs. Albright, a retired school teacher, who always seemed sensible, along with their new lawyer. Notably absent from the list, Brenda Milhouse. Excellent. The day of the meeting, I laid out my conditions to Tom beforehand. They were simple, non-negotiable, and designed to ensure this kind of nonsense never happened again. When Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Albright, and their lawyer, a Mr. Davies, arrived, they looked stressed and tired. We sat around Tom's conference table. Mr. Davies opened, speaking about the unfortunate misunderstandings, and the HOA's desire to restore a harmonious relationship with our neighbors at Solitude Springs. I let him talk. Then it was my turn. "Let's be clear," I said, my voice calm but firm. "There were no misunderstandings. There was a deliberate and sustained campaign of harassment and invasion of privacy, orchestrated by your HOA president, directed at me and my property. The billboard is a direct consequence of those actions." Mrs. Albright winced. Mr. Peterson stared at the table. "I'm willing to consider taking the billboard down," I continued, "but only if certain conditions are met." I then laid them out. 1. A formal, written apology from the Whispering Pines HOA for the surveillance, the baseless complaints, and the general harassment. This apology is to be signed by the entire current board. 2. A separate, personal written apology from Ms. Brenda Milhouse. 3. A legally binding agreement, drafted by my lawyer and reviewed by yours, stipulating that the HOA will never again install, or permit to be installed, any surveillance equipment aimed at or capable of recording activities on Solitude Springs Ranch. It will also state that the HOA will cease sending any unsolicited violation notices or complaints regarding activities conducted on my private property that are consistent with its agricultural zoning and historical use. 4. The surveillance camera that was removed from the pyracantha bush, and any other such devices that might have been deployed, are to be surrendered to me. I want to ensure they are truly gone, and not just relocated. 5. As a gesture of goodwill and to acknowledge the disruption caused, the Whispering Pines HOA will make a modest donation of $500 to the County 4-H Club in the name of good neighborliness. There was a stunned silence. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. Mr. Anderson, those are significant demands. Particularly the personal apology from Ms. Milhouse. She was the architect of this mess, I replied evenly. Her personal accountability is non-negotiable. As for the rest, they are simply what's required to ensure my peace and privacy are respected going forward. They balked, as expected, especially at Brenda's apology and the donation. There was some back and forth. Mr. Peterson argued that Brenda might refuse. Then the billboard stays up, I said simply. It's getting quite a bit of tourist traffic, you know. Good for local color. Mrs. Albright looked pained. We understand your frustration, Mr. Anderson, she said softly, but Brenda can be difficult. That's an understatement, I thought, but said, her difficulty is what created this situation. It's time she faced the consequences of her actions, not just the HOA as a whole. The meeting ended without full agreement, but they promised to take my terms back to the board, and, presumably, to try and strong-arm Brenda. For the next week, the billboard continued its silent vigil. I heard through the grapevine that the internal HOA pressure on Brenda was immense. Her own board was essentially telling her, apologize, or we are all going down with you on this. Finally, Mr. Davies called Tom. They'd agreed to all terms. Brenda, apparently, had capitulated under duress, though I imagined her signature on that apology letter would be etched with pure acid. A date was set for the official signing and the handover. Victory. Hard won, creatively achieved, but victory nonetheless. The billboard had served its purpose. It had spoken truth to power, or at least truth to pettiness, and it had won. The signing ceremony, as I mentally dubbed it, was a subdued affair held in Tom Callahan's office. Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Albright represented the HOA, looking relieved it was almost over. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, had the prepared documents. First, the official HOA apology, signed by all 5 board members. I read it carefully. It was suitably contrite. Next, the legally binding agreement, stipulating no more cameras, no more nuisance complaints about my roosters or tractors. Tom had gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, and it was ironclad. Then came the pièce de résistance, Brenda Milhouse's personal apology. It was short, curt, and read like it had been dictated through gritted teeth, but it was there, her signature a spiky slash at the bottom. Ms. Milhouse extends her regrets for any distress caused, Mr. Davies read, without a hint of irony. I almost choked. Distress. Right. They handed over a check for $500 made out to the County 4-H Club. And finally, a small cardboard box containing the offending camera, plus, surprisingly, a second, smaller one I hadn't even known about, which had apparently been briefly aimed at my access road from a different, less effective angle. Bonus. Once everything was signed, sealed, and delivered, I shook hands with Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Albright. "I trust this resolves matters," I said. "Indeed," Mr. Peterson replied, a hint of a genuine smile finally appearing. "We look forward to a more tranquil coexistence. True to my word, the very next day, Earl, his nephews, and I dismantled the billboard. It felt a little strange taking it down. It had become such a fixture, a symbol. But its job was done. I stored the panels and posts carefully in the back of my barn. You know, just in case. Peace, real peace, slowly returned to Solitude Springs Ranch. The air felt lighter without the oppressive sense of being watched. General TSO crowed with his usual gusto, uncomplained about. My old tractor sat proudly where it always had, a testament to enduring utility rather than an aesthetic affront. What happened to Brenda? Well, the rumors from Whispering Pines were swift and satisfying. Within a month, there was a special HOA election. Brenda Milhouse was unceremoniously voted out as president and removed from the board entirely. The last I heard, from Mr. Henderson, was that her for sale sign went up not long after. Apparently, the humiliation and the loss of her petty power were too much to bear. Good riddance. The relationship between my ranch and Whispering Pines settled into a wary but respectful distance. They left me alone, and I, in turn, continued to be the best darn rancher I could be, now with a slightly more legendary status in the county. Occasionally, someone would stop me at the feed store or the diner and say, "Heard about that billboard, John?" Good on YA, I'd just smile and nod. Sometimes, you have to get creative to protect what's yours. Sometimes, you have to fight fire with a very large, very public, and very factual sign. The whole ordeal taught me a few things. Document everything, because you never know when you'll need proof. Stand your ground, because bullies only push as far as you let them. And never underestimate the power of a well-placed, perfectly legal, and utterly infuriating piece of malicious compliance. Now, when I sit on my porch with my morning coffee, looking out over my land, the only eyes I feel on me are those of the deer grazing in the pasture, or the hawks circling overhead. The silence is broken only by the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods, the distant crow of a rooster who knows he's king of his domain. And every now and then, I'll glance towards the spot where the billboard stood, and I'll raise my cup in a silent toast. To peace, to privacy, and to the enduring satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guy with a bit of ingenuity and a whole lot of weathered fence posts actually wins. And if you're thinking of moving next to a working ranch and have strong opinions about aesthetic harmony, maybe just don't.